Hey there, Alex Kidman here. Today taking a look at this, the Google Pixel 8a, Google's latest affordable Pixel. Well, sort of. There's a couple of caveats there, which I'll get into a little bit later, but this is still Google's cheaper Pixel. It doesn't cost as much as the Pixel 8 or the Pixel 8 Pro, and it probably won't cost as much as the upcoming Pixel 9 and 9 Pro whenever Google chooses to release them. Pixel A phones have always been that way. They're kind of the replacement for the good old school Nexus phones, if you remember those. And if you remember those, then you've been around tech as long as I have, maybe even a little bit longer. The short form is, I quite like the hardware on the Pixel 8a. It's a nice improvement on the 7a. There's a couple of details, and one really specifically for Australian viewers, that I don't like quite so much. So let's get into it by first of all talking about the design. So look, in design terms, the Pixel 8a was never going to be a revelation, really, because that's not what the A series phones are all about. They're about affordability. They're about taking that essential Pixel design, shrinking it down slightly, making it more affordable. So there aren't too many surprises. The Pixel 8a is basically a smaller Pixel 8. So you get a 6.1-inch OLED screen with a resolution of 1080 by 2400. So that's marginally smaller than the 6.2-inch screen on the Pixel 8, but not by much. Now, technically, it's actually slightly higher resolution, or higher pixels per inch, I should say, slightly sharper, because you've got to pack more pixels into a smaller frame. But you'd kind of have to be Superman to really spot that kind of difference. This is a nice sharp screen though, and the big improvement here over the 7a is the inclusion of a 120 Hz screen refresh rate. So that's better for smooth scrolling, and in some games where it's supported faster scrolling and the like. It's a nice thing to have, and certainly far more expected at this price range than it used to be. It was a little bit disappointing that the 7a was only 90 Hz. Lovely to see it jump up to 120 Hz, especially as, again, that's what the Pixel 8 has already. In terms of the glass on that screen, look, it is only Corning Gorilla Glass 3. That's slightly down from the Gorilla Glass Victus that you get on the Pixel 8. So slightly less technically durable, although honestly, any phone drop could end in calamity. They're yet to invent indestructible glass per se. So you're still taking a risk at any point, which is absolutely why I favor cases. Now, similar to other Pixel phones, I also favor a case because you still have the camera bar at the back. And this means that the phone can never sit flat, never even remotely sit flat. But if you throw a case onto it, basically you create enough width around it that it does sit flat. I like that. I also obviously like and prefer cases, as you're probably aware if you've been watching this channel for any length of time. And if you haven't, hey, subscribe. In color terms, Google produces the Pixel 8a in Obsidian, which is black. That's what I've tested with. Porcelain, which is white. Bay, which is blue, again, those are very much Pixel 8 kind of colours, and Aloe, which is green. Although here in Australia, Google is not selling the green one. There's no Aloe phones for Australian Pixel 8 fans, unless you import one, or I suspect the cheaper way to do that, if you really like that colour, and green is a little unusual. You don't see too many green phones. The cheaper way to do that would actually be to buy the official green case. Buy the Aloe case, slap it on an Obsidian phone, and most people will not spot the difference, I think. In camera terms, look, the hardware specifications for the Pixel 8a felt familiar, and that's because they are. Put the 7a and the 8a next to each other in pure spec terms, and you're talking the same thing. 64 megapixel wide, 13 megapixel ultra wide, front-facing 13 megapixel selfie camera. No dual selfie cameras, although that was really a very, very long time ago. That was the Pixel 3, I think it was. I'm dating myself again. Anyway, Google was never going to massively innovate for the Pixel 8a, but honestly, it sort of didn't need to, because this is still a really, really good camera phone, mostly down to Google's AI, although I've got to specify here, I'm talking on camera AI. I'm talking things like super res zoom and the way that it does its post-processing to deliver a more natural looking shot than the massively oversaturated shots you get with a lot of camera phones. Not so much stuff like Magic Editor or Best or all the other stuff that largely starts to float into Google's cloud, gets processed there. That stuff, yeah, my experiences with it have been very hit and miss. It very much depends on the photo, but also that stuff's quite slow because you're reliant on an external server, and it's not terribly unique to the Pixels anymore. Google's been offering it now, or most of those features now, on non-Pixel phones, even iPhones if you've got a Google subscription. And so they're not really highlights, but what are highlights, and you should be viewing a whole bunch of photos I've taken on this phone now, are the actual photos and videos that you can take with it. They're just very well done. I mean, take Super Res Zoom, for example. So this goes up to 8 times zoom, and that's not a lot, but what I typically see in these mid-range phones that go up to about 8 times zoom is by the time you get up to 8 times zoom, you're looking at digital garbage. It looks really, really bad. Now, the Pixel 8a does not deliver a super crisp 8 times digital zoom, but it's way better than the competition. So, for example, over the weekend, I was at the rather excellent Nundle Wool Mill, look it up, and my better half's into craft, basically, and I stopped to take some photos of some of the milling machinery. And from a distance with the glass, this is what that looks like. And then with the ultra-wide lens, still quite a nice shot. Now, the 2 times zoom, that's fine, and I pretty much expect that to be, because if you halve out a 64 megapixel shot, you've still got 32 megapixels of quality to play with, and certainly photography is more than just a megapixel count game, but I'd expect the 2 times to work. The 8 times is where it gets interesting. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it's doing a fair job with some fairly complex wool fibers. And look, okay, maybe you're not into wool mills. Here's the same kind of thing, essentially, going from ultra wide to 2 times to 8 times with Sydney's Centrepoint Tower, if you'd like something that's a bit more of a tourist landmark. My basic point here is that Super Res Zoom does work pretty well given the limitations of the hardware you're playing at. It'd be lovely, of course, to see a proper telephoto lens on one of these, but I get that that's not really something that's super common in the mid-range just yet. Essentially speaking, the video and stills of this are really rather nice for the price. Yes, they haven't terribly innovated. It's certainly not worth jumping up from 7A for, but it's good, and that's really what you want out of a smartphone camera, isn't it? Google's played a very familiar tune when it comes to what's lurking behind the glass of the Pixel 8a, because it's borrowing from the Pixel 8, just like the 7a borrowed from the 7. And that means you get a Tensor G3 in this case, 8 gig of RAM, and either 128 gig or 256 gig of fixed storage. Google's never really supported microSD card expansion. As long as it can sell you some Google Drive, it never will. I don't like that, but it's what they do. But it's not just familiar in terms of, hey, it's the same generation hardware in a smaller frame. It's also that right now, at the time of recording this video, I can't actually throw you a whole bunch of Pixel 8a benchmarks. And that's because if you go to install those benchmarks, so I'm talking about things like 3D Mark and Geekbench here, the phone resolutely says, oh, they're not compatible with this phone. You can't run them. And it's garbage. I really hate that Google does this, and it does this for every single Pixel phone. It annoys the life out of me. Basically, I can pretty much guarantee you, within about a month, those benchmarks will suddenly start working. They just get blocked by Google for that initial launch period to stop reviewers being able to fairly compare them. And it's a really dumb move for this phone, because this phone is a Pixel 8. So if I take the Pixel 8 benchmarks, and that one does benchmark now, of course, it took about a month from when it launched before you could. If I take those benchmarks, then I can compare it and see what it does, because they're almost certainly going to be in the ballpark, if not downright identical to what the 8A can achieve in pure performance terms. And look, we know about the Tensor G3. It's nicely powerful. It is not the most powerful thing that you can get in an Android phone. That's still up in Qualcomm Snapdragon territory. That's still the preserve of phones like, for example, the Galaxy S24 Ultra, and that's a way more expensive phone, of course. So getting Tensor G3 performance in a phone at this price point, yeah, that's pretty decent. It compares well, and these games that Google play, they annoy me. They don't really help sell their phones. In fact, I'd say they hinder it, ultimately. And that's a pity, because this is a decent performing phone. I mean, you can throw higher end applications, you can throw games at it. Runs fine. They work quite well for the most part. They're quite good with that 120 hertz screen. Yes, you're playing on a smaller screen, but some people will like that, of course, because some people don't like those larger phone bodies. But it all runs quite nicely. It all runs quite well. I wish I could quantify it, and I will. I have a text review which actually has all those benchmarks in it. Link in the description below, and I will update that in about a month once I can actually properly benchmark this thing and put some proper numbers to it. But for now, I can certainly say this is a powerful enough phone for most people. It's also a nicely supported one, because this is going to get 7 years of Android OS upgrades. And I think that's a pretty good lifespan for an Android phone, no matter what, really. 7 years is great, especially in the mid-range. I mean, Samsung started playing around with that more for its premium Galaxy S lines. The A phones have a lesser quantity of years of upgrades. Other manufacturers, yeah, you're maybe lucky if you get 1 or 2. So 7 years is great to see. And of course, being a Pixel, you'll get those updates, you'll get those security updates before anyone else does on any other phones. The Pixel 8a is, of course, 5G compatible, only sub 6 gigahertz here in Australia. In my own testing in Sydney and in regional New South Wales over the past week or so, I've got my very much typical speeds, somewhere between 200 to 400 on the high end, a little bit lower if I'm in a worse reception area, and that's always the story with these devices. I'm not really hitting too many phones that have bad reception in that way to speak of on 5G, but they are limited by what you can do with a sub 6 gigahertz phone. This was never going to be the millimeter wave phone, although, of course, to Google's credit, the Pixel 8 Pro is the 1 millimeter wave phone you can buy in Australia right now. Everyone else needs to catch up there, and I'm going to presume that that's going to be the case for the Pixel 9 Pro as and when that appears. So what about the battery? Well, the Pixel 8a bucks the trend here because just about every Android phone has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery in it. And the Pixel 8a doesn't. You only get 4,492 milliamp hours to play with. So surely this is a bad phone. This has bad battery life because it's got less numbers, right? Doesn't work like that. Really doesn't work like that. Because it's basically to do with what the processor does, what the screen does, what the whole phone does with that power, more so than the quantity of power that it has. And here, the Pixel 8a, like its predecessors, performs really, really well. So using my standard YouTube battery test, where I run a 1 hour 1080p YouTube video at maximum brightness, maximum refresh rate, moderate volume, this phone only dropped 3% of its battery. Now, it's not going to keep going down in a linear fashion, but dropping down to 97% from a full battery is great. It basically indicates that unless you really hammer the phone, it's not going to go flat within a day. Multi-day is feasible if you're a very light user. Certainly, that's what I've seen. It's comfortably got through days where I've actually been using it quite a bit, filming with it quite a bit, or playing games on it quite a bit. It's a good performer there. It will charge wired or wirelessly. Now, this is a little bit slower than you'll see on the Pixel 8, 18 watt wired or 7.5 watts with a Qi compliant charger. The Pixel 8 actually goes a bit faster on wireless, especially if you've got the Pixel stand, for example. But typically speaking, that's enough. It certainly gets the phone charged reasonably promptly. Not necessarily fastest in class, but it's fine. So should you buy the Pixel 8a? Now, I did say that I had a specific point to make for Australian buyers of this phone. So what I'm about to say may not apply to you. The Pixel 8a here in Australia retails for $849, where the Pixel 7a was $749. That's for the 128 gig version, of course. So it's had a $100 price hike. And that's a little bit unfortunate on a couple of different levels because, well, for a start, let's take the US price. 7A in US, $499 USD. 8A in the US, $499 USD. We're getting slugged where the US home market is not. So this is not a price rise because the technology is better. It's a price rise that hits the Australian market. And the official Google explanation, what their representatives have told me, is that it's to do with currency value fluctuations. So the relative value of the Australian dollar to the US dollar. Obviously, this might affect other markets as well. I don't know. The problem is that doesn't really bear water either because actually the value of the Australian dollar to the American dollar has really only shifted like 1-2% at most in the last 12 months. Basically, we were getting the Pixel 7a at a reasonably cheap price, almost a little bit of a bargain. Now we're paying quite a bit much more for the 8a, more than that currency fluctuation and even evening it up would have accounted for. And I think that's really unfortunate, but it's not just a question of fairness. It's a question of competition in that space because the problem is, at $749, Pixel 7a was an immediate recommendation. Great phone. I'd still recommend it even today. At $849, the Pixel 8a has to compete with a lot of lower priced flagships from like 6-12 months ago. Now, I'm not necessarily talking your refurbished phones, but certainly older stock of prior flagships can be had, typically at just south of the 1,000 Australian dollar border. And $849 to 1,000, that's not a huge jump, but you'd get a huge jump in what you get in that phone. You'd get telephoto, you'd get faster wireless charging, you'd get a bigger screen, you'd get better, basically. And whilst this is a really good phone, the hardware is really, really good. That price jump and that comparison makes this a harder phone to recommend. I really like the hardware. I really like what they've done with it. All of it makes sense in terms of being a spec bump for the Pixel 7a, but that price point and that price jump really dims my enthusiasm for it. So it's a good phone, and obviously, if its price drops over time, run towards it because it's really nice. And obviously, that 7 years of updates will give it really, really long legs. But right now, consider it, but shop around. That's my advice anyway. So that's my take on the Google Pixel 8a. What do you think? Is there anything you'd like to know? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.